Chapter 16. An army on the march is a terrible sight to behold, Baron said. He peered through the glass at the mass of Keldon barges slowly advancing towards Arsenal City. The Kashin blimp he rode was high and miles from the Keldons. The fire barges accompanying the enemy force provided an umbrella of protection that he dared not violate. He could see the huge transport barges, some of which must have been just constructed, judging from their simple decorations and the almost pristine superstructures. "I see targets, not an enemy," Alexei said as she watched the forces snaking along the hills. "If it wasn't for those cursed fire barges, I'd be killing Keldons right now." She pointed, and Baron focused his sight back through the glass. The barge was low-slung and trailed smoke from secured braziers. The craft scuttled forward rapidly and then froze in a new position to provide cover for the column. Other fire barges could be seen dashing forward as the troop transports continued their advance. "If we could, I'd have you fighting now, but the new bombs aren't ready and won't be for weeks," Baron said as he looked at the Kapama League scouts who lay in ambush. "The design was finalized last week, but we're only starting construction. I don't know how long till we can get you to the ordnance you need." A blimp swung out of the cloud ahead of them, high in the sky. "Maybe that Mushan will have some luck." A dozen bombs began falling toward the ground. Every fire barge in the line cast flame upward in balls and streamers. The more distant vehicles sent skipping streamers at the Mushan dumped ballast to soar out of the range. When Baron reached out with his senses, he could feel gas generators on full bore as the ship tried to generate extra lift. "He has blowers on and the fire suppression is off?" Baron said with disbelief. Smoke clouds and particles of fire rose from the barges, and bombs fell into that space that cleared as the barges flowed away from the impact zone. One small barge was close to the drop site and shuddered to a halt before continuing after a few moments' pause. Alexei turned back to Baron. "If you drop from that high, the Keldon mages will simply push your bombs off target. You should have dropped them from a lower altitude." Alexei didn't contend the Mushan pilot for taking a chance. She only thought him too cautious. "Alexei, you're not thinking of a low-altitude run," Baron demanded. The Jamuraan mage only laughed. "Things will have to get a lot worse before I can talk the rest of the crew into a suicide run," she said, then sobered and considered the forces converging on Arsenal City. "I believe that by next week I'll be ordered to do so if the city falls." A group of Talarian runners and steel ants rushed from cover at the fire barge. The ants unleashed their rocket attacks en masse on the vehicle. The light loads that the ants carried didn't do much damage individually, but their collective damage shattered the vehicle's legs and smashed the catapult in the open interior. The secondary blast as the barge blew only knocked a few ants down as the League forces retreated at high speed. "Not much of a return for the risks they took," Alexei said as their blimp began to turn and fly at maximum speed toward Arsenal City. "No, but the fire barges are moving closer to the transports." Baron was looking back at the Keldon forces. "If we can keep them bunched up so they can't dodge, maybe a high-altitude attack will work before they reach the city. The other benefit in making them angry, we need them to attack the army immediately." Alexei only nodded, sadly accepting the fact that whatever the result of the coming battle, the Flying Navy would only deal with the aftermath. The army would have to fight on its own. The city and its defensive works appeared before them, and Baron got into a transport chair. The seat was a board on a sling that was attached to a rope dangling a few 100 feet under the blimp. Ground troops grabbed the rope to steady it as Baron slid down. When he disconnected, the blimp jumped up and its fans were shrill as it climbed. Majida and Shalanda were among the ground crew. "How does it look?" General Majida demanded. "The scouts are attacking the stragglers and going after the catapults," Baron explained, waving Shalanda toward him as he saw her walking through the camp. "The scouts obey orders and continue their hit-and-run tactics. The Keldons should perform as expected and attack immediately." Armorers set additional reloads outside the perimeter to load returning scouts and the steel ants. The Marines were loading mantises with the heavy war rockets that filled their main weapons module. Baron planned for the machine to cripple the transport barges while they were unloading. The men servicing the war machine seemed confident, but the infantrymen were nervous. Crates of rockets were moved out of supply dumps as the battle approached. Shalanda, any sign of the contagion spreading from the eastern forests? Baron asked. If things went badly and there was a siege, illness could destroy the League army as brutally as a Keldon attack. There seems to be just a few small pockets of influenza, but no mass kills of animals or infection in the fields, Shalanda replied. I've isolated the flu carriers and those who may have been exposed. Hopefully there won't be any problems. Rain's aide still looked troubled. Baron pressed further. Can you do anything if there's a flare-up of disease? The wizard asked. We've curbed outbreaks of disease before, but I'm still uncertain about this one's true nature, and I can't pinpoint its source, Shalanda said candidly. The blight and death of wildlife could strip the League as surely as the Keldon army. Baron waved for her to withdraw, focusing on the problems of fighting the immediate enemy and allowing others to deal with the blight and the wildlife deaths. Majida moved closer as Shalanda made for the runner depot. How many do you make of the attackers? Majida asked. The general seemed filled with nervous energy, and Baron wondered if it was fear or anticipation that fueled Majida's emotions. I would estimate the number of Keldons and war mannequins at between 10 and 20,000. Majida's face fell as Baron stated the size of the attacking army. The wizard tried to curb the blow. We knew we would be outnumbered. That's why we decided to dig in and engage the enemy here. He pointed out to the defenses that did not look quite so substantial now. Make them assault fixed positions and prevent them from surrounding us piecemeal. And we've learned that the Hollow Warriors can be deployed for only a short time. We will win if we hold fast and force them to exhaust themselves. Majida only nodded and ran to oversee the issuing of additional ammunition. The Kapamu League would be outnumbered at least 4-1, and the infantry's lack of experience might be a blessing. Perhaps most of the men did not realize how truly desperate things had become. Baron went to talk to his wife, following in Shalanda's footsteps. He neared the runner depot where Rain readied her runner for the press of battle. The runner was being carefully reloaded, the normal complement of war bolts replaced by enhanced models that would do more damage at the sacrifice of range. Rain was part of the regular army now. She had more experience than most of the current riders in using the machines. Jolriel and Shalanda still tracked the extent of the blight and the animal kills, but Rain convinced Baron that her skill at maintaining and managing the runners would be better employed in combat. I still wish that you could stay within the walls, Baron said to his wife. She finished securing loads for her personal weapon, so they would be at hand during the coming fight. The light runners and the steel lance that we used are speed machines. Fighting in fixed positions would limit the damage we can do. Besides, the city's a trap if you don't win the initial battle. Out there, I can reform and retreat far faster than the enemy can follow. I know your plan's based on exhausting the Keldons, but I'd rather have room to maneuver. You're right, of course, but I still can't help how I feel, Baron explained. If things go badly, I want you to withdraw west at your best speed. The other coastal and river cities have raised massive armies and are slowly working their way east. I think that if we could just hold the city against this attack, the League will be able to fight for the conquered lands instead of waiting for attacks. Baron gripped her shoulders and drew her into an embrace. Your troops will be at the heart of any actions east. He paused for a moment. You must be willing to accept our defeat if it comes to a choice between preserving your forces and saving the city. Rain kissed him and mounted up. Her mixture of Talarian and League soldiers followed her out of the defensive works to link up with the hordes of ants stationed in hidden depots far from the city. Baron hoped that he and the city would survive the day, but felt better that his wife was sure to survive. It was only minutes later that the first barges began to become visible. The Keldons deployed well back from Baron's works. The invaders were far enough away that they could retreat or activate their Hollow Warriors before his heavy war machines could cover the distance. The Keldons gathered, and while there was no evidence of a clear and organized attack, a lot of gray-skinned warriors were leaving their vehicles. The wizard sent a runner back to the communications room to convey the information to Teferi. Baron considered the growing ranks of warriors and then hurried to the command post. Majida's bunker was heavily reinforced and provided an excellent view. Communication runs and trenches converged on it. As Baron ducked inside, he saw Majida donning armor with the help of his aide. The metal seemed to shine even in the indirect light, and the golden lion was riveted high over the general's heart. Majida grimaced as an aide finished wiping the device. I'm supposed to inspire confidence and awe in the men, the general said, as if a fancy set of armor will turn the course of battle. At least the men will be able to pick you out of the crowd, Baron replied diplomatically. I know a better way to capture their attention, Majida said, gripping his sword with a free hand. The sword was ordinary and worn, the scabbard of dirty leather. I dug myself out of the grave with this sword, and I rallied my men by slaying the enemy. Deeds are what the men need to see, not fancy armor. Baron only nodded his head. Reputation can be a weapon more valuable than a sword. It drains the heart of your enemies and gives strength to your men. That armor may seem foolish now, but after the battle it'll be part of your persona. It'll be expected by your men, feared by your foes. A messenger entered the bunker, his cheeks flushed from running. The enemy's readying themselves for attack, General, the soldier reported. The main thrust could happen within an hour. Tell the Marine squads and their mantises to start their attack, Vegeta ordered. The soldier and Vegeta's aide left at a run. Baron stood to the side as the men went by. In only a few minutes, the League would execute the attack plan that Baron and the commanders had developed. General Vegeta lifted a tankard of beer from the table and drank deeply, emptying it and then slamming it down. I leave the command to you, Baron, Vegeta said as he pulled on a helmet, picked up a shield. I can do the most good in the front works. Baron followed the general outside. The sun was shining brightly, and Vegeta breathed deeply. Remember that you and the other magicians are the final reserve. Vegeta glanced back toward the city. Magic users were forming a circle on a balcony looking out over the battlefield. Commit them if the army falls. We need a victory of arms rather than magic if we ever hope to take the battle of the Keldons. He nodded and started down through the connecting trenches, calling to the men he came across. Baron was left alone with only a few runners waiting to carry additional orders. He must not fall, Baron said, calling magic to send his senses over the coming battlefield. The Keldon camp was a pool of naphtha waiting to explode as he tasted the quiescent magic driving the alien artifacts. The circle of magicians in Arsenal City was a circle of chanting children trying to raise power. Finally, the League trenches and earthworks appeared, a field of gopher holes that Baron sensed among the scattered war machines. Even as his senses tried to focus on Vegeta, the attack commenced. The League made the first move. The marine mantises had been concealed in trenches at the front lines. At the prompting of their handlers, each lifted out of its hole and walked silently onto the field. Less than 200 of the machines had been constructed by the overworked factories. The mantises advanced with a few lightly armed marines jogging alongside. They approached the enemy without fanfare. The machines and men in small groups looked helpless against the opposing army. The Keldon barges were in line surrounded by soldiers putting on their armor and stroking braziers as the mantises came closer. The warriors emptied smoking coals and shaved kolos horns into receptacles on their armor. A haze of smoke arose, and a light breeze blew the fumes toward Arsenal City. Baron could see the soldiers becoming more fearful as the smoke increased. The wizard detected a surge of energy as the warriors walked into barges and powered war mannequins. The Keldons began chanting as they prepared to charge, promising death to the League soldiers waiting for them. Warriors shouted derisively at the few war machines standing before them. The mantises raised their arms and lowered their hindquarters as if in response. Then, with a roar, each machine fired a heavy rocket at the Keldon barges. A few rockets detonated on launch, and mantises exploded, cutting down the surrounding machines and men. The first League deaths of the battle were self-inflicted, but the remaining rockets arced and fell onto the barges. The craft's heavy protective shells shattered in huge sprays of splinters. Secondary explosions bloomed like flowers as hero's blood ignited and incinerated barges, leaving climbing balls of flame. The League soldiers behind the trenches ran into the remaining vehicles and drove them away from burning piles of wreckage. Delayed detonations set huge pieces of machinery flying in all directions, killing warriors and shearing through other barges. A cheer went up as the mantises turned sharply and retreated back to their hiding places. Baron could see Marine technical troops digging out new loads of heavy rockets for a second wave of bombardment. General Vegeta stood outside a trench with sword held high. His armor caught the eyes of the troops and they began chanting, "Lion! Lion!" as his golden emblem flashed on his chest. The fear that the Keldons inspired was momentarily gone. Baron counted it as a victory. Then he felt the swell of magic as the enemy finished animating their hollow warriors and charged the League earthworks. The mantises were nearly inside the trench line when their heads turned 180 degrees. Each launched a small rocket, lashing into the ranks of enemy soldiers. Mannequins and men sundered in sharp explosions. The Keldons screamed in rage as the mantises jumped out of sight into the trenches. The enemy was a sea coming to sweep the League away when crabs reared up and fired. Hundreds of them had been buried during the night. The machines fired only light rockets, but each crab carried 6 of them. The leading ranks of the charge dissolved into gouts of bloody foam as the machines fired in a massive coordinated blow. Warriors floundered in the remnants of their comrades, and the charge stumbled to a stunned halt. "Fire!" Vegeta called as he rose once more from the trenches holding a launcher. The general discharged a war bolt that vanished into the milling crowd of the enemy. Baron couldn't tell if anyone fell, but the infantry in the trenches began firing in sporadic barrage. There was a serious shortage of launchers and war bolts, but the fire was a light rain on a pile of sand. The Keldons were dissolving away under the attack. Baron could see the League technicians loading the weapon modules of the mantises and crabs. For a moment, the wizard hoped the enemy might break, but then warlords in fantastic armor forced their way to stand in front of the Keldon lines. Baron could hear their shouts as they exhorted the warriors.
Do you think victory and glory are free?
An armored giant of a man bellowed.
A great people are known by the strength of their enemies. Kill for the glory of Keld. The final days are upon us. Kill the thieves. Kill them.
Even as they shouted, Vegeta was leading men and machines from the trenches, gambling on breaking the enemy's spirits. Baron wondered at the boldness, but knowing how outnumbered the League forces were, he acted to make the blow as strong as possible.
Attack the rear!
The call echoed through the ether as the wizard drew power, called to the light forces beyond the battlefield. Rain's troop of fast runners and ants was out of sight, but he knew that they charged at his call. The crabs from the trenches slowly advanced. Each few yards a fusillade of bolts poured from their weapons bays. Some of the supporting infantry knelt and fired launches while the rest advanced with swords and spears jabbing into the air for blood. Vegeta was just behind a crab trotting forward, signaling the advance with every step. The Keldons started forward. They came at the League in a string of disorganized driblets instead of the unified front that the warlords desired. More bolts and rockets flew toward the enemy, but the Keldons were implacable now, advancing in a silent rage. Vegeta halted and dressed his line of men and machines. Clumps of spears faced the enemy and formed small arcs of soldiers anchored by crabs. The heavy war machines launched all their weapons at point-blank range, and then the forces met. The soldiers with spears funneled Keldons and hollow warriors to the crabs. Massive metal arms rose and fell. Mannequins and men almost exploded as they died under the relentless pounding clubs. The bodies mounded up into piles, and the crabs inched back as warriors mounted the shattered bodies to continue the attack. Now League soldiers were within range of Keldon swords, and infantry dropped screaming as gray-skinned warriors shattered bones and parted flesh. The soldiers carrying launchers drew swords. Vegeta shouted and mounted the back of a crab, spear in his hand. He yelled and signaled for the League troop to back toward the earthworks. The crabs slowly stepped away from their mounds of victims and began rebuilding their fleshy barricade with new corpses. Vegeta was covered in blood and poorly balanced on the back of a crab, but remained there as he directed the withdrawal, needing the extra height to be seen. Axes and spears flew toward him. The crab deflected them, smashing them out of the air. Baron raised more power, and his senses flew toward the general. He enveloped Vegeta in a web of power. The wizard could feel crossbow bolts burning to ash as Keldons finally began sniping at the general. Vegeta threw his arms wide in defiance at the enemy, trusting in the magic that surrounded him. The League withdrawal slowed as the general's actions brought fresh heart to his men. The wizard could hear Vegeta whispering through the surrounding magic.
I really hope you can keep this up, Baron. Otherwise, I'm dead.
More weapons flew past the waving arms of the crab to burn up in the wizard's shielding spell, and Baron drew more power, waiting for the Keldon mages to enter the fray. Then cheering rose from the retreating troops. Hordes of steel ants came swooping from the distant flanks, falling upon the enemy.
Your wife is coming to save me from myself, Baron,
General Vegeta said to the wind. Rain and Shalanda on their runners fired groups of bolts into the Keldons, tearing at them like rabid dogs. Wing blades scissored as they cut apart groups of warriors. Steel ants nipped at the enemy, leaving wounded who stumbled and crawled through the ranks. Rain had directed the ants around her to wound rather than destroy. Baron had protested the inhumanity of the tactic, but Rain insisted that wounded warriors were more trouble to the enemy than dead ones. Additionally, the ants were less vulnerable if they didn't linger over their kills. Hundreds of voices screamed and tore at the will of the Keldons, confirming her tactics.
Send the mantises against the Keldon transports,
Baron ordered. A runner tore his eyes from the battle, ran to relay the command. Vegeta was holding the line and retreating at a crawl that allowed more Keldon warriors to reach the crabs. Here and there, a machine went down as axes and swords sheared legs free and a crab collapsed. One huge Keldon used a crab arm as a giant club, leaving a trail of smashed League soldiers dead among the field of crushed enemy warriors. Vegeta shouted orders and then led several swordsmen against the champion. The general dodged an overhand strike and his sword cut the tendons of the warrior's arm. The Keldon grabbed Vegeta with his free arm, and the general battered the warrior's face with blows from his helmet until a League soldier cut him free. The steel ants still lashed the peripheries of the enemy as the Keldon center advanced into oblivion under the hammering metal arms of the crabs. Now Baron saw the mantises charging the left wing of the enemy army. The colorful machines broke through the thinning lines, their long arms slicing through flesh and mannequin with equal ease. Then the Marines and their charges were through the barges only a few hundred yards away. The machines ran forward as their handlers ordered them to engage at point-blank range with their reloaded rockets. Then Baron sensed magic from the Keldon barges like a sea of fire burning. Slaves and barge crew rushed out of their craft in a panicky mess, and flocks of birds issued forth. They circled and rose high over the battlefield, then fell onto the League forces. As each small body smashed into a soldier or machine, it disintegrated in a sharp explosion. Baron could see the center melting away, the bludgeoning crabs chewed to pieces by the attack. The surrounding infantry died as men fell with sudden ghastly wounds. Majida struck out at a diving bird, and the resulting explosion tore at his arm and knocked the general to the ground. More bomblets dived from the orbiting flock, now striking at the steel lance that had feasted on the flanks of the enemy. Shalanda went down as her runner was struck, and Rain attacked the Keldon warriors who rushed to kill her aid. The mantises fired rockets, but many had already fallen or were crippled, and only a few barges exploded. More of the tiny bombs launched into the air, and Baron knew that only magic could save the day. "Throw fire and lightning!" he called to the magical reserves. A long stream of power leaped from Baron up into the sky. Explosions rippled through the flock, disrupting its structure and sending many of the birds spiraling to the ground. The League and the Keldons suffered equally as men died and huddled for shelter. From the circle of magic behind them, a diffused cloud of flame moved toward the birds. The birds began to detonate as the outskirts of the flock flew within the League spell. Baron sent energy to shield the friendly forces, but the battlefield was too large. He concentrated on shielding Rain and Shalanda as the rest of the fire swallows fell out of the sky. Finally, the rain of death stopped, but the League center was down, and the Keldons rushed into the defensive works. However, Baron felt rising hope. The warriors and mannequins moved slower and stumbled even as they tried to exploit the breach. Baron could feel the Keldons stopping as some began to fall in exhaustion or even death as their fighting machines sucked the last energy from their frames. The wizard's heart lifted even more as he saw Rain and Shalanda back up. The scouts and their runners had survived. The handlers directed their ants to attack once more. The outskirts of the enemy could only beat weakly at the small machines as war mannequins stopped in mid-swing and warriors collapsed. "We need to reinforce the center," Baron ordered. "Everyone will advance and engage the enemy." Runners ran to order technicians, cooks, and quartermasters to charge the enemy. Baron walked forward, raising power as he prepared to slice the trenches clean of invading warriors. Then he was stunned by a surge of new magical energy from Arsenal City. The magic users had not recognized the Keldons' weakness. Magic that Baron hoped to direct against the enemy was instead expended in a wordless ringing call. His senses seared by the wave, it took him precious seconds to regain his equilibrium. During that time, Teferi appeared on the battlefield. The planeswalker jumped into the defensive works, and Baron could hear him calling. Teferi's magic touched him, but only Baron's momentary injury communicated itself to the planeswalker. Surrounded by enemy warriors and dead League soldiers, Teferi cast a mighty spell. Energy rippled out in a huge wave through the ground. Even those with almost no magical talent could feel the surge. The ground began to liquefy, flowing into the trenches and burying Keldon warriors and the League dead. Out on the battlefield, huge sinkholes appeared and sucked down the enemy corpses. The land barges tossed and bucked as the land danced under them. The Keldons retreated in confusion and fear as the ground itself showed allegiance to the League. The soldiers who had been around the crabs climbed to their feet and reformed as the retreating enemy flowed back to the barges. The center was saved, but the effects of Teferi's spell continued to spread as Baron watched. Steel ants bogged down as thousands of small pits opened up. Marine mantises, almost in firing range of the Keldon barges, were shoulder deep in the ground, their arms tearing furrows as they tried to slash themselves free. More Keldons retreated, struggling through the mud holes appearing everywhere. Baron could see the land barges advancing into the muck as Teferi's attack waned. The huge craft moved slowly, but were able to reach the core of their army. Majida was up, but nearly unrecognizable. "Cowards!" he yelled, and struggled forward. Covered in mud and blood, only the device in the general's helmet identified him. He slogged a few steps, his injured arm hanging limply at his side before falling down once more as he passed out. "We survived. That's the most important thing," Rain whispered into Baron's ear as the couple clasped each other tightly. Rain's runner had finally battled its way through the uncertain ground and the dead as the wizard struggled through the earthworks to find her. was a chance to destroy the Keldon forces, and now they've withdrawn. Baron looked east in anger. Our first chance to crush the enemy on land, and we missed it. Teferi and the support troops were bringing the wounded and the war machines into the city. Here and there, a Keldon warrior was found alive, and troops converged to capture them. Rain only nodded non-committally. She stepped past him and knelt to inspect a fire swallow. It had started life as a bird, but at some point was transformed into a weapon. Their eyes were stitched shut, the feathers were glossy with some sort of coating. Baron sniffed the air and could smell the refined tufa liquid draining and soaking into the dirt. Those were an unpleasant surprise, Baron said as he looked at it. Battle was in our favor before they launched. Someone clearing her throat interrupted the couple. Shalanda stood thick with mud. She'd been inspecting the battlefield and the casualties. She had just come from healing some of the wounded, and she breathed heavily as she reached the strength to try again. 70% of the wounded should be ready for duty in 2 weeks, Baron. But we might have a problem. That flu has cropped up again against some of the wounded and the personnel helping clear the battlefield. Maybe a few weeks before the illness burns itself out, she declared. That's fine, Baron replied. It'll be a few months before we can concentrate enough forces to march east. He straightened, his lips thinned. I think we've turned a corner in this war. From now on, we take the fight to the enemy.